Welcome everyone to the Harvard Buddhist Community 2021 Buddhism and Race Speaker Series, which is organized by the Harvard Buddhist Community, a student club at Harvard Divinity School. My name is Lim, and I am a member of the Buddhism and Race Planning Committee. I am calling today from Seattle, Washington State, which is the traditional land of the Coast Salish people, including the Duwamish people, past and present. Since 2015, our annual Buddhism and Race conference has brought together Sangha leader, activist, scholar, and student from diverse backgrounds to build capacity in addressing power at the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, and class in our community. This year, the conference has been reimagined as a speaker series with monthly virtual event from January till August. So we believe strongly in supporting racial justice, not only with our action, but also, not only with our words, but also with our action. This month, we encourage you to support open-hearted Indigenous women leader protecting the sacred West Berkeley Shelmon, named one of the America 11 most endangered historic places. And also learn more about the work of Buddhist Peace Fellowship. The link will be available in the chat below and will be sent in a follow-up email after the event. If you are signed into our webinar, closed captioning is available. We are recording the event tonight and will make it publicly available on our YouTube page and our website. I'll pass it to Chantal.
Thank you, Liam. My name is Chantal Sanchez, and I'm also part of the Buddhism and Race Planning Committee. Like Eva and Kyla, my home is in Somerville, Massachusetts, home of the Massachusetts people. Today, the Massachusetts people remain in New England and in diaspora, along with their Indigenous neighbors, including the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. If you would like to know more about land acknowledgements and further actions you can take to support Indigenous people in Massachusetts, you can visit the website for the Massachusetts Center for Native American Awareness. We also encourage you to learn more about the history of genocide and colonization of the place where you live, as well as about the Indigenous communities currently living near you. We are pasting links in the chat to help you get started. Now, our series hopes to both respond to the virtual environment we find ourselves in, as well as this particular socio-political moment in US history. The events of the past year have demonstrated how structural racism has engendered systemic suffering that literally kills Black and Brown people and destroys communities of color. With these forms of racial violence in sight, it is clearer than ever that racism is the issue of our time. The Sangha is not immune or separate from these issues. In fact, an apolitical version of the Dharma is a direct product of white supremacy, which further codifies oppressions and reproduces anti-Blackness, as well as other forms of racism in and around our communities. We need to bring the tradition forward to unwaveringly meet the issues of race and racism. And passing it off to Kyla.
Thanks, Chantal. My name is Kyla Franks, and I'm also a member of the Buddhism and Race Planning Committee. And we are so excited to welcome you to the 7th monthly event in the 2021 Buddhism and Race Speaker Series. The title of this series is Radical Reorientation, and our goals for the series are twofold. First, we are focusing on building a shared understanding of Buddhist approaches to racial justice with a critical examination of racism and white supremacy in Buddhist communities and scholarship. Second, we are focusing on the collective work of addressing internalized oppression, which obstructs both individuals and communities from living into their full potential. We seek to move beyond an abstract, apolitical, and individualistic engagement with the Dharma. Instead, we seek to cultivate spiritual practices that can tend to the myriad forms of embodied and socially imposed sufferings created by what Bell Hooks refers to as the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. In short, we are called toward a radical reorientation of the Dharma, to move beyond racial integration towards decolonized, indigenized, and anti-racist practices and communities. And I'll turn it over to Eva.
Hi, I'm Eva, and I am also a member of the Buddhism and Race Speaker Series Planning Committee. And before I introduce our speaker today, I'm excited to say that we have over 150 people signed in to the webinar and live streaming on YouTube, with more people joining every minute. We are so glad to have you here. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Today, Katie will give a 50-minute or so presentation, which will be followed by about 25 minutes for Q&A. The chat will be closed during the presentation, although you can contact the panelists, and we will open it again for all participants in the Q&A. So it is my honor to introduce the 7th speaker in the Harvard Divinity School Buddhism and Race Speaker Series, Katie Loncke. Katie is a lifelong paradoxivore, one who feeds on juicy contradictions to fuel evolutionary activism and organizing. A political troublemaker for over 20 years and a Buddhist practitioner for nearly 15, Katie currently serves as director with the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, a global constellation of spiritual seekers asking, is it possible to fight oppressive systems while cultivating the qualities of an undefeated heart? Over many years, Katie's activism has spanned a wide rainbow arc of issues, from feminist housing justice to environmental defense, cop watch, prison abolition, queer and trans solidarity, police demilitarization, alliance with Native sovereignty and rematriation, and the Black Lives Matter movement. Whether flying with political kid puzzles outside of Walmart for union organizing, or helping Greenpeace climbers rappel off a bridge to block the path of an Arctic drilling ship, Katie's experiences of seeking compassionate confrontation have led them across the world and back into their own breath and body. Welcome, Katie. We are so honored to have you with us today.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you, Liam and Chantal and Xavier and Kyla. Thanks everybody on this beautiful planning committee for being so strong in your truth-telling and your radical analysis. It's very exciting what's happening here, and I'm just so grateful. I'm calling in today from occupied Ohlone lands, also known as Huchin, also known as Oakland. Oh, I'm hearing that it's hard to hear me. I will try to turn up my volume and see also if I can speak louder and use my theater voice, in case that helps. But just keep letting me know if something's wrong with the volume. Great, thanks, Lori. Yeah, it's a beautiful day out here. I am grateful to be breathing pretty clean air that's not too smoky. As many people may know, out here in occupied California, we are subject to annual wildfires at this point. This is essentially a direct consequence and outcome of colonization, genocide, and the interruption of the symbiotic ecological relationships between Native people and these lands, in which Native folks have been tending the land through fire, through cultural burns and intentional burns for many, many, many thousands of years. So I just feel very aware in my body that every day that I'm able to breathe freely and go outside without worrying about inhaling smoke from these wildfires is a major gift. And it's also a pretty haunting sadness that we've come to this point. And the harm that has been done and is being done to many creatures, many beings, human and more than human, is a lot. And so gratitude and grief live side by side in my heart, not only around the air, but of course around the water. No, oh, I see.
Check 1 2, check 1 2. Is this better for folks? Okay, okay. We're making our way. Great. Yeah. Yeah, so in case anyone missed it, I was simply saying that, you know, I acknowledge and I'm grateful that today I'm able to drink clean water, I'm able to breathe fresh air, I'm wearing clothes, I am sheltered, I have food that was grown and packaged and shipped and sold and prepared by workers. I have access to medical resources, healthcare systems, imperfect and fraught as they are, staffed by workers doing very hard work, especially in this pandemic climate. And I just don't take any of this for granted. And I like to start with this kind of gratitude, acknowledgement, partly because I'm very inspired by Buddhist traditions that I've heard around cultivating wonder and awe at just how unlikely it is that we would be here together, that we would not only find our way into these bodies, into this human birth, but also find our way to be able to hear the Dharma, to have it land with us in some meaningful way, consider it, and then maybe even apply it and try to find out some more about the truth of how life is through these powerful ancient teachings. And I love all of the stories and metaphors, like a sea turtle that only surfaces to the ocean's waves once every 1,000 years. And when it surfaces, its head pops through a golden ring floating on the water. That's how rare and lucky it is that we are here together in this human birth, able to help each other get free if we can. And I also don't take for granted that we are talking about how to end racism, right? And so many people, so many ancestors, so many beings over the past 500 years or however long our current versions of racism have been entrenched. People have also been devoting themselves, struggling to free us from these forms of violence and misunderstanding. And also the hierarchies and the power dynamics and the forms of violence that precede our contemporary versions of racism. People have been working to transform those too. So just starting by coming into this body, appreciating all that it may feel. I invite you to join me if it feels good. Maybe taking a couple of deep breaths, or feeling the earth underneath you, supporting you, where you're sitting or standing or lying. Maybe giving thanks for this body, this miraculous, beautiful body of yours that offers life, rather than seeing our bodies as fetters to be cast aside or obstacles to be transcended. Maybe just taking a moment to appreciate that there is a body, as the Buddha said. And from this basis, we get to be together in practice. And just gratitude again to the coordinators of this series, because in our conversations and preparations, they've mentioned that part of the aim of this series is to help get us a little bit out of only being in our heads, in our minds all the time, and more towards action, more towards embodying the values and the wishes that we have for freedom and care and love and ending racism. So thank you so much for creating a good culture, a good container for being able to explore how we might do this together. All right, with that very long preamble, I'm excited, really excited to dig in with you all today about, how can we end racism? How can we fight oppression while maintaining undefended hearts? And the phrasing of an undefended heart, or the qualities of an undefended heart, I first heard them, or they first stuck in my heart, from Dalila Bothwell, who's a Black queer Dharma leader in the Insight or Theravada US-based lineage. And I just loved them so much, and they've stayed with me. What are these qualities of an undefended heart? And Dalila talks about them in part as the 4 Brahmaviharas. So I thought that that's one place we could start. I'll start sharing slides soon. We'll talk about the Brahmaviharas. But yeah, the title of this talk around racial justice goobers and open-hearted activists, I thought we could define some terms a little bit. And, I consider myself a bit of a goober, in the sense that, I love words that don't necessarily come from Latin, Greek, German, those are the words that we use in the English language anyway. It's refreshing to encounter words that don't come from those root languages sometimes. And goober comes from a word guba, I believe, in the Kikongo languages of Central and Western Africa. According to what I've read, it means peanut, which is interesting to me too, because the peanut, I think, originates in South America, but came to Africa, where the groundnut, which is a different plant, had been in use and in circulation for a very, very long time. And now, in Africa, they grow a lot of peanuts, but also people are trying to help the groundnuts make a comeback. And it's all kind of mixed up, as things tend to be in this very topsy-turvy world of constructed categories of race and ethnicity and geography, migration, diaspora. So as someone who is also a product of diaspora and migration myself, my dad's side of the family coming from West Africa via the Middle Passage to the Caribbean and then to the occupied United States, my mom's side of the family fleeing anti-Semitic violence in Austria and Germany. I just have an affinity for words and plants and beings that migrate and may have to pass through some tough times in the process. My little bit of research on goober indicates that there may be people who have used it in a racist way. And so I hope to reclaim it with a bright spirit and appreciate that even when we are working with very heavy topics, we don't have to take ourselves seriously all the time. I hope. And some of my wise elders have shown me. Yeah, okay. And so then for open-hearted activists, I would rather show you than tell you. So let me open up my screen. Okay. I will share this screen. Great. Can y'all see okay? I see yes. Okay, great. Okay. We're going to end racism and explore the four Brahmaviharas, the qualities of an undefended heart, with a shout out once more to Dalila Bothwell. And if Dalila was quoting someone else that you know about, also please feel free to tell us in the chat. I'm always interested to learn lineages. So many of you may already know this, but the four Brahmaviharas traditionally are upekkha or equanimity, metta or loving kindness, karuna or compassion, and mudita or sympathetic joy. Such beautiful qualities. And I have personally found so much inspiration in the Buddhist tradition around even uplifting qualities like this, and doing so as a response to the threats, dangers, persecutions, and inevitable pains and sufferings of life. So this painting depicts a classic scene called the Bhumi Sparsha, or touching the earth. And traditionally, it's the moment when the Buddha, after practicing as an ascetic in the forest for many years, finally resolves to follow the middle way towards enlightenment, towards awakening, and sits under the Bodhi tree with strong determination, aditthana, to not get up until he is fully awakened. And this is when Mara, these sort of demons of distraction and temptation and threat, start surrounding the Buddha and trying to throw him off his seat. And I see in this image the equanimity, the upekkha of an undefended heart. I see some compassion. You know, the Buddha is untroubled by Mara, maybe even emanating and radiating some loving kindness. Sympathetic joy might be a little harder to find, although I like to think that the Bodhi tree had a lot of sympathetic joy. And the earth had a lot of sympathetic joy, and does and continues to anytime a being awakens or experiences even one moment of tasting awakening. I think there's a lot of sympathetic joy happening. The sunset, right? You can see it in the colors. So we decided at Buddhist Peace Fellowship to update this painting. Oh, and again, this painting, I've been looking at this for almost a decade now, and I love it. And I don't know the artist. It's one of those things that I've just found on the internet over and over, but never found a source. So again, if you know, please share the wealth, spread the knowledge. Would love to know and to credit them appropriately. We worked with an illustrator, a young non-binary, wonderful illustrator named Seiji Ige, to update the Bhumi Sparsha image to reflect some of the racial justice struggles and just the spirit that we're committed to at Buddhist Peace Fellowship. So you can see in the sort of upper left corner, a SWAT tank, police, some pretty heavy weapons, some drones or airplanes. We've got some pretty angry white or light-skinned folks, one wielding, brandishing an All Lives Matter sign. We got an Uncle Sam kind of version in the upper right-hand corner. We've got the Wolf of Wall Street, some coding numbers wafting up from his phone. And we've got a sort of nuclear missile warhead. And these snakes too that are, I think Seiji's imagery was like the heartbeat monitors meant to represent medical debt. And there's a very faint ivy pattern on the other snake, which is meant to represent debt in higher education, like the Ivy Leagues. So many threats, right? Many threats approaching, and yet our central figure, backed up by the Bodhi tree and the sunset and the waters, is touching the earth as witness to their right to awaken, and also raising a power fist, now a classic symbol of liberation struggle, popularized in Black liberation struggles. So I think it's pretty obvious why we wanted to update this, not only to reflect some of the modern forms of Mara or threat that we might encounter as activists, and then be challenged to maintain an undefended heart, even amidst those circumstances, but also like we often see this colorism that makes its way into imagery of enlightenment, literally so light, so light-skinned. And this is, you know, an insidious form of racism reproducing itself in some of our images. Like the more awake someone is, the lighter their skin, or the thinner they are, the more beautiful they are. You know, all these kinds of things permeate our culture. So in little ways, day by day, we try to free ourselves from those messages. Just the earth inviting us to take a couple breaths as we move on. Considering the qualities of an undefended heart as racial justice activists. Some friends from the earth. I was basically just here to remind me to breathe and to laugh. Okay, so I promised you 5 big Buddhist questions for racial justice movements and activists. So this is number 1. Number 1 is about time. And to be very, very clear, there's no right or wrong answer to any of these questions. They're all explorations based on what I've experienced, what I've witnessed, some of the big kind of juicy, contradictory, conflicting questions that I would love to hear your thoughts and your experiences about, and just share a little bit of what I've seen. So with time, how do we experience time as people who are committed to ending racism? I've experienced, this is an oversimplification, but just for the sake of our conversation, 3 main ways that I relate to time and that I see people relating to time in racial justice movements. So one is fully staying in the present moment. And I hear a lot of encouragement for this in our spiritual spaces, right? In our sanghas. Thich Nhat Hanh has said, we take care of the future by taking care of the present moment. We make our home by arriving in the present moment. And I've heard in a Rinzai Zen lineage that was very founded in a martial arts practice, they talk about wielding your sword and cutting precisely in between the present and the future, at that precise spot where the present meets the future. So right on the edge. How do we maintain that present moment awareness? And for all kinds of reasons that I'm sure many of you know way better than I do, this is a very important part of many forms of Buddhist practice and training, cultivating our ability to stay present. Now, I'm going to skip to the outside to deep visionary time and just say that, I've often heard in many indigenous traditions, people talk about a 7 generations perspective. We want to think 7 generations into the future and 7 generations going back into the past when we are taking any kind of action or even just living our day-to-day life. If we're here to serve, how can we think about how to serve 7 generations into the future, long, long after we will be gone or passed away from this body? And also in a Buddhist tradition, I've heard discussion of kalpas, or these very, very, very long, you pretty much can't wrap my mind around them, kinds of eras, long, long eras. And sometimes these are used to describe the time between different Buddhas taking birth and turning the wheel, the Dharma wheel, or sometimes kalpas may be about the way that the Dharma itself kind of rises and crescendos and falls in the teachings as they kind of degrade in human hands, as far as I understand. But anyway, however you like to approach deep visionary time, I also love how, Larry Ward, who's the author of America's Racial Karma, speaks beautifully about staying rooted in the present moment and then casting forward into the future. So that link between present and deep visionary time, however you like to think about it. The changes that we're trying to bring about are long. The arc is very long. But so what about this middle part, the strategic time? This is the most common form of time that I see used and related to in social justice or racial justice campaigns and projects and struggles. And what I mean by strategic time is like, when are we going to get kids out of cages? Or when are we going to stop a pipeline? Or when are we going to stop a coup or lift sanctions or an embargo? Or, any kind of medium-term effort to block some of the harms and the effects of racial violence, right? And this is where we get a lot of urgency. Oftentimes, it's where our campaign strategies can be successful or they can fail, and we can learn from them either way. So again, this is an oversimplification, but from what I see, these different forms of relating to time, these different ways of relating to time, are often in conversation, in the mix, in how we relate to our racial justice work. And I'm just very curious about the impact or the effects of that on us as agents, as people who are interested in ending racism together. So I think we're going to try to do a poll. We're kind of experimenting with this technology, so I'm excited to see if it works. And the question is, in your racial justice work, how do you tend to relate to time? And again, there's no wrong or right answer. We're just noticing tendencies. And apologies once more for this oversimplification, but it would be so lovely to just see. We're here. How do you tend to relate to time? More so by staying in the present moment, more so by leaning into deep visionary time, or more so by staying focused on strategic time so you can kind of get the work done. Thank you, Xavier, for posting this poll. Give folks a moment to vote. It says that I can't vote. I've been disenfranchised because I'm a panelist. But are we able to see the results? Ah, okay, interesting. So present moment squeaks out over strategic time by a little bit, and deep visionary time is still well represented. Okay. Okay, I don't know if that's because this is like a very Buddhist crowd. Present moment is the winner. It doesn't totally surprise me, to be honest. But cool, it's interesting to see the combination, the breakdown. Awesome, very fun. Okay, next one, enemies. Okay. So, beloved Thich Nhat Hanh, who of course coined the phrase engaged Buddhism and interbeing, and to whom we owe a great debt at Buddhist Peace Fellowship. And I think most of us who are doing Buddhist plus any kind of justice work. He says, to love our enemy is impossible. The moment we understand our enemy, we feel compassion toward them, and they are no longer our enemy. So this big question is going to be about, how do you relate to enemies? Do you have enemies? Do you not? Do you agree with this worldview, with this approach that Thich Nhat Hanh is sharing? The moment we understand our enemy, we feel compassion, one of the qualities of the undefended heart, and they are no longer our enemy. To be really honest, I struggle with this one, which is why I'm excited to bring it to you all. I see how bringing compassion or dignity, kind of a holistic understanding of those who may oppose our aims, can be so beautiful. And this classic striking image of Aisha Evans in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, July 2016, following the police murder of Alton Sterling. I'm going to just briefly go through a few images of sort of racial justice resistance to racial violence, racialized violence. And they represent quite a range of what it might look like to orient towards an enemy or a non-enemy. So sometimes orienting towards freedom, towards resisting racial violence can look like this. Sometimes it can look like this. This is, of course, the burning of the Minneapolis police precinct after the murder of George Floyd. It can look like this. This is the Haitian Revolution, which took place around the turn of the 19th century and inspired and set off many, many waves of enslaved African rebellions, liberation struggles. I know that Shante Paradigm Smalls talked about Harriet Tubman in one of these speaker series, and Harriet Tubman was a part of an armed revolutionary insurrectionist Black resistance lineage that connects to Haiti or Haiti. So just wanting to honor a couple of these different ways that orienting towards an enemy or not an enemy can look. So my question to you in your racial justice work, do you have enemies? Or do you have entities that you treat as enemies, which could include corporations or infrastructure like pipelines, or politicians or police. Again, no judgment, no right or wrong answer. It's an anonymous poll. So out of friendly curiosity, are you like, yeah, of course I have enemies, a lot of them? Do you say, no, I don't have enemies because I adopt this approach of seeing no one as my enemy? Or maybe you're kind of in the middle and you're like, yeah, I have a few enemies, some. And I'm trying to move somewhat quickly through this so we have time in the Q&A to really discuss this, because I know that a poll is such a very flattening way to have this conversation. But thank you for bearing with me and sharing a little bit of your experience. Okay, most people have a few enemies. Wonderful. Oh my gosh, Dalila, you're here in the chat saying that qualities of an undefended heart comes from your teacher, Martin Aylward. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I love hearing that. So, oh gosh, the poll already disappeared, but hopefully you saw it. You got to take in. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. We have most people in the middle and some on either end as well. Probably a lot more diversity, which I'm hoping we can talk about later. I also see somebody in the chat saying adversaries might be a better word. Maybe, but maybe the people saying, yes, I have enemies, literally are like, yeah, they are enemies. So we can definitely speak for ourselves, but that's the point of this conversation, is actually inquiring for each other. You know, what does enemy mean to you? Do you like it? Do you not? Cool. All right, judgment. Judgment. Yeah. How do we relate to judgment as racial justice activists cultivating the qualities of an undefended heart? Martin Aylward. Okay, I'm going to have to start naming all the people in that phrasing lineage. I mean, it's hard not to judge. That's the point of these next few images. I find it hard not to judge. And much of the political organizing culture that I've been trained in, raised in, brought up in, that I feel very grateful for in many ways, is about that quote from Utah Phillips, which is like, the earth is not dying, it is being killed. And the people doing it have names and addresses. It's trying to organize us around targets to apply pressure, which often takes the form of shaming or some form of economic undermining, and definitely judgment, saying this is wrong, this should not be happening. So that was the Athabasca tar sands, if folks couldn't see it. And just to quickly mention that according to the Indigenous Environmental Network, the tar sands oil fields, which feed a number of pipelines, including Line 3, and fed the now vanquished Keystone XL pipeline. These tar sands oil fields cover land 5 times the size of Denver, nearly the size of Tokyo. And the cultural heritage, land, ecosystems, and human health of First Nation communities, including Mikisew Cree First Nation, Athabasca Chippewa First Nation, Fort McMurray First Nation, Fort McKay Cree Nation, Beaver Lake Cree, First Nation Chippewa Prairie First Nation, and the Métis are being sacrificed for oil money in what has been termed a slow industrial genocide. So these are some photographs by Anita Mitta, who's a Desi photographer, Dharma practitioner, racial justice and radical organizer who attended the Tar Sands Healing Walk in 2013 and took these really striking photographs. I'm going to close the chat for now, y'all. Not because I don't love you, but just because I want to focus. I'll come back to it later. So what does it mean to not judge? Or to judge? Francois Paulette, who is Dene Sulin from Smith's Landing Treaty 8 First Nation, said, while Anita was there, "I have much compassion for those who have lost their spiritual intellect." Right? It's like, who are the people who can cause such harm? And do they deserve our compassion? Do they deserve our judgment? Is judgment tactically necessary and needed to get them to stop acting from a place of lost spiritual intellect and causing harm? So my question for you around judgment, in your racial justice work, how much are you using judgment and shame? And I'm a broken record, but there's no right or wrong answer. Really, truly, in a lot of my movement groups, it's very hard to even imagine how to run a racial justice campaign without using some amount of shame or pressure on a target. Even if we're in our minds and in our hearts not dehumanizing them, this is most of what I see. Shame and judgment, a reminder of what's right and wrong, which side of history will you be on, things like this. So, very curious for you. Do you use judgment and shame a lot, never, or somewhere in between? Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for those who are completing these polls. I can identify in a way with all three of these answers. I think throughout my life, I've been in kind of each of these places where I'm using judgment and shame a lot, where I feel like, wow, the more I use these, the less I am investing in the future that I want. Like, how do I get off of this toxic cycle of judgment and shame? Especially if that judgment and shame directed towards opponents starts to creep back into my close relationships, or my view of myself starts to kind of color how I'm viewing everyone and everything. Yeah, and most of the time I'm hanging out somewhere in between, like you all. Cool, thank you. Okay, my next question is about contentment. So again, revisiting this image, I see a lot of contentment and the freedom of contentment in this image. And it makes me wonder about our relationship to contentment in our movement cultures, in our movement worlds. I love this image as well. This is from the No Dapple struggle the Standing Rock struggle, water protectors backed up by the sunset or the sunrise, rather probably, much like the Buddha or any being who's awakening might be backed up by a Bodhi tree, or water or land or fire or air or ether. And there's a certain, for me, there's a certain contentment that is often sparked or fed, nourished by contact with earth elements, with somewhere where, I mean, all of earth is earth, whether it's city, whether it's, you know, fossil fuels, human-made things or not, but the parts of earth that feel like awe to me help lead me towards contentment. And so my question for you, and we can give this a few more minutes maybe to think about it or I can ramble out loud a little bit in case that helps anyone who's a verbal processor. But in your racial justice work, how do you relate to contentment? And you'll see, I think that there are more options in this one. So you might feel, I would like to feel more contentment in my racial justice work. Or you might feel like contentment feels to me like complacency. So I'm wary of contentment. Like, how could I be content in a world with so much systemic and structural violence? So I have experienced this personally. There's sometimes been a very close, tight-knit relationship between contentment and this sort of fear or worry about complacency. Maybe you're like, woof, this is a lot, Katie. Like, I need more time to consider this question. I don't know how contentment plays a role in my racial justice work. And maybe you feel not content with any of these options. Also valid. Yeah, really, I would just like to know from you how you're doing. So which will happen in the Q&A. But for now, how are we polling? What does it look like? I really appreciate that at least some people choose each option. So, yeah, maybe most would like to feel more contentment. A lot, like next highest, contentment feels like complacency, so I'm wary of it. Some folks want more time to consider it. I hear you, I feel you, take all the time you need. And some are not content with any of these options. More power to you. I hope you'll raise your hand in the Q&A and share your relationship with contentment. Wonderful. Okay, number 5 is a big live question in my experience. It has to do with competing needs. I am not sure where I first heard the phrase competing needs or if someone specifically coined this phrase, but I do know that I first started hearing the phrase in groups like Sins Invalid or folks who are disabled. Maybe it was like Max Airborne and Don Haney, my former co-director at BPF. And competing needs are, in my experience, when like literally 2 individuals or 2 groups each need something that steps on the toes of the other. So this last final question is going to kind of be about like, how often do you encounter competing needs in your racial justice organizing? And of course, like if we have enough time, I would love to hear how you navigate these situations. But let me just give you a couple of examples from my own experience. I'm going to pause the share. Oh, wait. Do I have to stop the share? Okay, I just want you to be able to see my face so that I can relate to you more directly. Okay, one common example of a competing need that I experience and encounter in racial justice organizing is around fragrances and scents and folks who live with multiple chemical sensitivities or chemical injury and who cannot be around any kind of fragranced hair or body product or any kind of incense or copal or sage being burned or smudged. Yeah, any kind of, and sometimes it's even, you know, essential oils, like all organic, all natural, may trigger people's chemical sensitivities. And so I really want to shout out East Bay Meditation Center and Mushim Patricia Ikeda for holding it down for many, many years in this delicate negotiation of how to create fragrance-free spaces that are also supportive to people of color, Black and Indigenous people of color. Because partly thanks to anti-Black racism and misogynoir, in the words of Moya Bailey, most of the products that are made for Black hair care or Black body products tend to have fragrances and perfumes added to them. And there's not a lot of great options, especially not affordable ones, for folks who have kinky curly hair or Black hair to be able to take care of their hair without fragrances that, again, make other people sick, potentially. So, yeah, I experienced this really recently when this wonderful Black hospice chaplain, who's a woman, moved into a room in my home. We sublet one of our rooms, and she understood that we were a fragrance-free home and we use fragrance-free cleaning products and things like this, but like it just wasn't, we didn't do a good enough job explaining to her like the extent to which we need to be completely fragrance-free or like very, very low to no scent. And because partly also because of her job and the racist, the long legacy of racist standards to which Black women are held in a quote unquote professional setting, how Black women's hair is supposed to look, how Black women are supposed to smell or not smell in their body odor. You know, like Black folks also just notoriously are like, we don't want to be funky, like we want deodorant. And so what are the options for a form of deodorant or, you know, body products that are not going to trigger, in this case, like it was a housemate who is South Asian. So it's like people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, people of color with competing needs, with a need to feel good in our bodies, you know, to feel also employable in a racist system, a racist and sexist economic system. And yet, you know, not wanting to do harm to our comrades who get migraines and headaches and maybe, you know, put out of commission from encountering these fragrances. And another version of this, as I briefly mentioned, is ceremonial burning or smudging or copal, you know, incense. These kinds of things are, of course, very important to many Indigenous or traditions or people of culture. As Resmaa Menakem says. And yet those too can trigger people, including people of color, with chemical injury. We had recently a time when a healing circle for primarily Black mothers who have lost children to gun violence and mostly police violence, a friend of mine was organizing it and was looking for some meditation cushions, zafus, and back jacks and things that people could sit on, and was like, oh, could we borrow maybe some from the East Bay Meditation Center? So I tried to like link them up and make the connection. And I didn't think it through that, yeah, EBMC, East Bay Meditation Center, has a really strict, they need to strictly maintain their fragrance-free environment. So they can't actually lend out their equipment, their zafus, their zabutons, to groups that cannot guarantee that they will not come into contact with any kind of smoke or scent or fragrance or anything like that. So it was a sad moment, because it's like, of course we want to support this beautiful work to empower and bring healing to Black women in the face of police violence. And, we need to maintain a safe space as much as possible also for people who need a fragrance-free environment. Yeah, okay, I think I'll go back to sharing. Just a couple more. So when thinking about competing needs, in my experience, sometimes if we feel our needs are too much, or if they're putting other people out who we care about, like our comrades in the struggle, sometimes it's hard for us to actually advocate for our own needs, right? And this means to me that we have an opportunity to, again, apply some of these qualities of an undefended heart to loving kindness for ourselves and for our needs, as well as the needs of other people, and understanding that sometimes they're just incompatible. So I love Bell Hooks when she says, when we can see ourselves as we truly are and accept ourselves, we build the necessary foundation for self-love. Whether we learn how to love ourselves and others will depend on the presence of a loving environment. Self-love cannot flourish in isolation. So part of why I find this so relevant to the question of competing needs in our racial justice struggles is, again, whether we learn how to love ourselves and others will depend on the presence of a loving environment. So this is what we are seeking to create when we oppose anti-Blackness, or when we oppose white supremacy, or when we oppose heteronormativity or transphobia, right? We have to create the loving environment that allows historically marginalized people to have the space to cultivate the foundation for self-love. Otherwise, it's a lot of gaslighting about like, well, if you should just learn how to love yourself. It should be easy for you. If you just practice hard enough, you'll do it. Not necessarily, right? Bell Hooks says, self-love cannot flourish in isolation. So this is a huge part, I think, of what we're asked to do, what we're called to do in anti-racist work, is actually cultivating loving, thoughtful environments where we can love ourselves even through our competing needs. Even through those times when maybe, oh, it feels like I'm like maybe imposing too much or asking for too much, or I'm going to make this other person upset or this other group upset, or how dare they ask me to change something about myself. It's like, okay, can we like soften a little bit and really cultivate enough compassion to be able to navigate competing needs? I don't think I have really time to do justice to this story, but just very briefly, this is a photo of Stacey Park Milburn, my friend who passed away last year, last May, and was this total badass, amazing disability justice, queer activist and person of color. And Stacy brought incredible love and care and intersectional analysis to many struggles for environmental justice, racial justice, demilitarizing the police, so many different struggles. And I just want to lift her up and lift up her work because it feels important to this project of cultivating the environments of self-love where self-love can flourish so that we can navigate competing needs that inevitably come up with as much compassion as we can. And also loving these words from Audre Lorde, Black lesbian, poet, philosopher. Nothing I accept about myself can be used against me to diminish me. I also think of that Bhumi Sparsha image, right, of touching the earth, of just saying, yes, I don't have to be better than anyone else, you know, but if I just accept that I'm here, I too have the capacity to awaken. Mara can't get to me. Use it against me. So in your racial justice work, I'm curious, how often do you encounter competing needs? Hopefully I explained it okay, but if not, we're about to go into Q&A, so no problem. Do you encounter competing needs constantly? You're like, this is the story of my life? Is it maybe sometimes or rarely? Or never? That's a lot of options grouped into one. Or maybe it's kind of your first time considering this. This question of competing needs. I would so love to do an entire workshop or series together as Buddhists in racial justice movements, sharing struggles and lessons around competing needs. It's like always relevant for me. Oh, wow. Okay. So a lot of people are saying yes, constantly encountering competing needs. Fabulous. I want to learn from you. What do you do? Sometimes, rarely, or never. Yes, is another second highest. And some folks first time considering this. Thank you so much for letting us know. That's great. That's great. Okay, my friends, we have come to the end. Let's stop the share. Thank you so much for your kind attention. And I would love to open up some Q&A. I think we're going to do the first part by just submitting your questions so that they can be read aloud, so they'll be still recorded and live cast. And then we're going to turn off the recording to avoid liability so that we can ask you to raise your hand and actually come on screen so we can have a real conversation. But we just can't do that part when it's recorded for legal reasons. Am I getting all this right, y'all? Sorry if I... Great. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Katie, for that wonderful and very engaging presentation. So we have been collecting questions throughout the presentation, but if new questions are emerging, we encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask them. And we'll have about like 20-30 minutes, and then we will do a closing practice, and then we'll do the after happy hour where you guys get to directly engage with Katie. So we are now opening the chat up in the webinar also. So if you want your message to go to everyone, make sure you are sending your chat message to all panelists and attendees. Please know that any hateful or violent speech in the chat won't be tolerated, and we may choose to remove participants from the event. Also, if engaging in the chat doesn't feel supportive, For you, please know that links to any important resource in the chat will also be sent in the follow-up email. We are also posting instruction on how to disable the chat feature in the chat. If you are joining tonight by webinar, we are going to leave the room open for conversation. Yeah, I talked about that, yes. So yeah, let's see. So there are a few questions. So I think I'm gonna ask the first, or like, does anyone want to ask question? Or there's like a one that's coming up right now. And it says, I really appreciate the framing you offer. I wonder if you have thought on how to do this with folks in a more secular way without mentioning Buddhism for folks who might not be open to that.
Thanks for that question. Yeah. To be honest, I find it challenging because, yeah, I think that there's a great risk of seeming pushy or condescending with trying to impose the qualities of an undefended heart unless someone really wants them. You know what I mean? Like, I don't find that it works too well to like prescribe them. But when we have, I mean, that's why I feel so fortunate to be in this space, to be able to share a little bit of language, a little bit of understanding, not requiring that we agree on everything, of course. But yeah, I think that I would first try to listen in for the group, the more secular group, about if this is something that they are truly interested in, rather than trying to impose it. And if that is present, if that true, genuine interest is present, sometimes I talk about this stuff in terms of compassionate confrontation, which is, yeah, just a phrasing that I've used and loved. And I also see so much beautiful work that's deeply resonant around this that happens from many other traditions. So like Buddhism does not have a monopoly, as far as I can tell, on qualities of an undefended heart. They may take many names or many forms or different varieties in different cultures or spiritual traditions, or even somatic traditions. I see a lot of good work coming out of generative somatics and Black organizing, leadership development, bold trainings, and ways that people can rediscover agency in our bodies and in our emotions as we work to end racism, as we work to fight oppression, and to be a little bit less reactive in that. And so I don't think that there's any need to frame it in a Buddhist way, but it's something that I am so jazzed to get the opportunity to do. Cool. Thank you. Is there another question?
Yeah, and just as a heads up for folks in the webinar tonight, so we're probably only going to take 2 more questions for the recorded portion, but if you are joining via webinar, we hope you'll stick around after the formal closing. We're going to keep the webinar open for continuing conversation. So the next question for you, Katie, is this participant said, thank you for this lovely talk. I find myself thinking of many systems as the enemy, and I'm challenged to understand how I might transcend this kind of oppositional thinking, which seems binary to me, at least on the surface.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if that was Jungwon who asked that question, but I saw you in the chat. Hi. If it's not you. Yeah, such a good question. My friend Kazu Haga, who's a student of Kingian nonviolence, often quotes King and others in their commitment to fighting systems and not individuals, right? Like denouncing systems as evil, but not people as evil. So I'm not really a trained Kingian nonviolence, organizer, and that's not my expertise or my background. But just to like name that for some people that really works for them, to be like, yeah, the system is my enemy. We're going to defeat the system. So maybe that's great. The reason that I bring up Thich Nhat Hanh and really pose and offer this question to all of us is to engage with, his perspective, which to me seems, maybe as you're implying with your question, kind of even more radically non-dual, in that perhaps if we look even in the causes and conditions that have created certain systems, we can start to understand with compassion how they arose, whether through collective mass trauma that gets passed down in various ways, through commodity fetishism and the sort of decoupling of the human labor and suffering that goes into the commodities that we end up buying and pricing, right? Like the obfuscation of all of that humanity and suffering, or ecological and more than human suffering that goes into creating a commodity. To me, what it means is to be able to see deeply into the causes and conditions that give rise to the systems of harm that we have inherited, and to not let that be a cause for despair or giving up, but for compassion. Because also, right, like Grace Lee Boggs says, every victory leads to more contradictions. So the work is never really going to be done. And even the things that we try to do in the best way that we can, the ways that we try to contribute to ending racism in the best ways that we can, are going to cause new contradictions. Not because we wanted it that way, not because we meant to, but it tends to happen. And so can we have compassion also for folks who are struggling against racism in ways that end up maybe also causing different types of harm, and interacting with systems that put pressure on them. So I don't know, that might be an evasion of your question. I would love it if you might want to come off of mute after we stop recording to engage further. But my question kind of back for you is like, is there something important that you gain from being able to see a system as an enemy? And I would just love to hear more about that. I think that it very possibly could be true. Or is there something that might be gained from trying on a release of seeing anything, including systems, as enemies, and more just as conditions that take some of the charge out of it? Thank you for that question.
Thank you, Katie. So this will be our last question for the recorded portion, and then we'll open it up and hopefully have some folks stay on and have some conversation. But for this, we had a great question posted into the chat asking, in the context of trauma, when the nervous system is activated, holding an undefended heart maybe isn't possible until the nervous system can come back into regulation. Do you have any thoughts about that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, such a good question. Yeah, this has been coming up as we've been sitting with this phrase. Yes, please don't choose to overextend vulnerability in a way that will bring harm to yourself. I also wish this for myself. I will say to myself, Katie, you don't, like, literally in my sitting meditation posture, it's been pointed out to me that I tend to open my heart too much. And this is also a wisdom practice to remain centered. To me, remaining more centered in equanimity, in compassion, in loving kindness, and in sympathetic joy all feeds into inviting myself into a healthy, well-soothed, and well-regulated nervous system, and learning, like taking the time to actually learn and practice how to do that for myself. So it's not about, like, yet again having to earn some kind of merit badge of self-improvement of like, my heart's totally undefended, 1000%, I did it. Like, to me, that's not what it's about. To me, an undefended heart says, I have the power to have compassion even for people causing harm. It does not mean that I will not recognize that they are causing harm. It does not mean that I trust them necessarily to stick to their word or follow through with their promises. But while trust is built and earned, loving kindness I can extend. That's my choice. And it doesn't have to be what I choose to do all the time, but personally, it feels good to me. It feels good to me to practice in compassion, in loving kindness, in sympathetic joy, including for all of my comrades in parts of the struggle all over the world. So again, I hope that wasn't evasive, but yeah, I hope that loving kindness also extends back to ourselves, and taking good care of ourselves too, of our hearts. Not overexposing where it's going to cause risk or cause harm, not over-compromising or overextending, but also continuing to inquire whether it's possible to offer loving kindness, offer compassion, even while continuing to fight or protect. Thank you for that great question.
Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you all for joining us for this 7th event in the Harvard Buddhist Community's Buddhism and Race Speaker Series. Next month, will be our final event in the series, and it will be a panel of BIPOC Buddhist leaders and moderated by Larry Yang. And you can learn more about it and join our mailing list by clicking on the link to our website in the chat. And stay tuned for the unrecorded session, a conversation session with Katie. But first, let me pass it over to Eva to lead our closing practice.
We invite you to take a moment to rest your attention on your body and the quality of your breath, to be fully present in your own experience. We dedicate any merit generated by our work tonight for the benefit of all beings. May all beings be happy, healthy, safe, and free of suffering. May we find liberation together. Thank you so much for joining us. If you are joining tonight by webinar, we are going to stop the recording to leave the room open for conversation with Katie, so please stay signed in. For everyone watching via live stream, we wish you well and hope to see you next month.
Thanks so much, y'all.